At the Washington Post, Chris Cillizza reported today that Mitt Romney is adding 2 new communications professionals to the Mitt Romney for President communications team, or ROMCOM, as we call them when we're in a hurry. This follows an avalanche of bad news and, frankly, bad handling of bad news over there. All the new detail on Bain, the Swiss bank account issue, even his own surrogates calling for his tax returns, even as some of his other surrogates say, no, don't release the tax returns, getting booed at the NAACP. The members of Team ROMCOM have been really back on their heels all week long. Just as an example, here's how Team ROMCOM handled just the last 24-hour news cycle. This right here, I can't make it look any better than that. This right here appears to be the only picture that exists of Mitt Romney's big, high-profile fundraiser in Wyoming last night with former Vice President Dick Cheney. That's it. A picture of people's backs taken from a distance from behind a pole, maybe a tree. That's the only photo. The Romney team was so nervous that their candidate would be photographed alongside Dick Cheney, Mr. 13% approval rating, that they banned TV cameras from covering the event. The LA Times reports, quote, a pool of reporters was allowed into the country club event, but media photos of Cheney and Romney together were not permitted. Not only were reporters banned from photographing Mitt Romney and Dick Cheney together, they weren't even allowed to eyewitness the 2 men standing together. Quote, when Mr. Romney arrived at the reception, he greeted Mr. Cheney with a handshake and Mr. Cheney's wife Lynn with a kiss, but reporters who were within view were promptly escorted out by the campaign. Then a little while later in the evening, quote, once at Mr. Cheney's private residence, a pool reporter within earshot of Mr. Romney's remarks heard Mr. Romney invoke Mr. Bush, but was not able to make out the context and was again escorted away by a campaign staffer. The Romney team went to great lengths to allow there to be a Dick Cheney-Mitt Romney joint appearance last night, while also squelching any discussion or evidence that Mitt Romney and Dick Cheney have anything to do with each other. That is a hard one to pull off, right? And then, in that same news cycle, the we're not like Bush Cheney at all news cycle, in that same news cycle, somebody in Romney land apparently had the genius idea of floating as Mr. Romney's vice presidential nominee, the highest profile person from the Bush Cheney administration who was not George W. Bush or Dick Cheney. Ta-da! But please don't think of George W. Bush. So yes, they are getting some new communications people in over at Romney land. Seems like a good idea. With or without, though, these, I'm sure, excellent new communications folks who are coming in to try to tune up the shop at ROMCOM, it's going to be hard for them to run from the real connections between Mr. Romney's campaign and the last Republican presidency. I mean, even if Mitt Romney has so far managed to avoid being seen next to George W. Bush, there are now a bunch of statements on the record of him and Dick Cheney making proverbial googly eyes at each other. Mitt Romney saying back in September that Dick Cheney is a, quote, man of wisdom and judgment, somebody that he would model his own vice presidential pick after. Dick Cheney saying last night, when I think about the kind of individual I want in the Oval Office, that man is Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney then returning the favor, saying of Dick Cheney last night, quote, that's quite a man, quite a leader. 17 of Mitt Romney's 24 foreign policy advisors are people who served in the Bush-Cheney administration. When Vice President Joe Biden accused the Romney campaign of being laden with Bush-Cheney foreign policy guys, the Romney campaign conference call to rebut that charge was led by 2 Bush-Cheney foreign policy guys. And on matters of policy, in terms of what they are in favor of, Mitt Romney and Dick Cheney are on the same page, even just on very simple issues like the wars. Like Dick Cheney, Mr. Romney says it was a great mistake. In his words, it was tragic to end the war in Iraq. And like Dick Cheney, he also does now not want a war to an end to the Afghanistan war. I understand some of what they might think is the appeal of floating Condoleezza Rice as Mitt Romney's vice president, particularly since it's not about Bain Capital, and that makes it a comparatively good topic of conversation today. But did they not realize that putting Condoleezza Rice into today's news would make people think, once again, about all of the connections between Mitt Romney and the Bush administration? Is Condoleezza Rice supposed to be so blindingly interesting that we don't remember why it is that she's that famous? Or maybe it was an intentional thing. Maybe the Romney campaign is finally getting closer to allowing the photos, right? To saying publicly that a Mitt Romney presidency might be a third term of Bush Cheney. And hey, what about it? Joining us now is the host of the great new show, Melissa Harris Perry, here on MSNBC, a woman named Melissa Harris Perry. It's great to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Which is your dream ticket? Mitt Romney, Condoleezza Rice, or Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney?
Oh, no, it's Romney Rice.
Why?
Well, for lots of, Romney Rice is fun to say. But there's actually some reasons I really like a Romney Rice ticket. One is I like the idea of a Condi Rice, Joe Biden vice presidential debate. I think that's an actual debate about folks who have sort of foreign policy conversation about the two big issues that have dominated our foreign policy scene, Afghanistan and Iraq. And I would like to hear Condoleezza Rice talk about how she would defend that, particularly in a political circumstance, which she hasn't had to do. So I would love that debate. The other piece of it is I am ready for an America with an African-American woman political scientist who used to be provost of a university as a vice presidential candidate. It just makes me happy.
Well, she was Secretary of State. She was National Security Advisor.
That's right.
She's definitely got chops. I was an attendee of that university when she was the provost there. And if that was some sort of audition for something, I don't think it recommended her. I can tell you from my personal experience. But the idea of Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney has long been my favored matchup because I want to call the question. Right? I want to call the question on whether or not the current Republican Party is an inheritor of the Bush-Cheney legacy or whether something has changed. And if something has changed, what's changed? Because there's this lacuna, to use a favorite term of Condoleezza Rice, between what they are allowed, between what we know happened in the Bush-Cheney era and what Republicans explain about what they do different. There's this gap. I don't know what they do.
Well, and you know, part of what I think is interesting about this, like we can't stand next to Lynn or Dick Cheney, and we were not going to say George W. Bush's name in earshot of any reporter, is exactly this challenge of what the Republican Party currently is. Yeah. Now, we've talked about it, I think, in the primary season around the kind of moral Southern right-wing base and how is a relatively moderate rich guy going to sort of pull along those populist right-wingers. But the real challenge, I think, is not just showing those up. That's part of it. But the other real challenge is how do we manage the fact that our last Republican president was not Ronald Reagan? It was George W. Bush. There's a real record of Republican decisions there. And those are all decisions from tax policy to the reduction of a social safety net to foreign policy that looks precisely like the record that Mitt Romney wants to run.
Are we getting close to a point where Romney starts pivoting to defending Bush-Cheney, though? That he starts pivoting to defending those years? I mean, with all of those advisors, with the Dick Cheney thing going on, the float of the Condoleezza Rice thing, which I can't say is from the Romney campaign, but nobody believes Drudge made it up himself.
Right.
I mean, are they getting close to the point where they start saying, actually, the Bush-Cheney years were good years?
No. I don't think as long as we're at 13% approval ratings for Dick Cheney.
That's where he was at when they left office.
Yes, that's right.
But still polls on it.
Yeah, but I mean, look, we saw those bumper stickers fairly early on in the Obama administration, the George W. Bush bumper stickers, do you miss me yet? But I think the resounding answer was
like, no.
No, in fact, no.
No, thanks for asking.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Melissa Harris Perry, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right, the new Melissa Harris Perry show is weekend mornings, 10 a.m. here on MSNBC. Mandatory viewing. All right, still ahead. The man who is turning out to be the strangest senator in Washington is still refusing to do an interview on this show. But once again, he is making news on this show. Strange news from Senator Strangey McStrangerson. That is still ahead.